Hello, my name is Lisa Martinez, and this is my case study for EDL 850. So for section 1, what happened? We are at St. Regis High School. It's a K-8 high school in a rural area. Student population is more or less 420 students, 2 teachers per grade level. They've got an annual budget and a small amount of extra dedicated to purchasing either computers or new software. Not a huge budget and not a huge state allocation. The computer lab has been purchased, and this year and next year are supposed to be dedicated to purchasing new software. Mrs. Lynn, who was hired as a full-time position, but who was previously in a part-time computer assistant position, had worked with Mr. Sample, the principal, to prioritize the list of what was needed, being that it would be aligned with the instructional objectives. Mrs. Lynn had developed a program, a rotation, but after about 4 months of teachers going through this rotation, several teachers asked her to make copies of the newly purchased software programs so that they could be installed in classroom computers, which would facilitate or more just a more easy access for more students on a more regular basis. So she complied with that, and the PTA president supported the idea. Mrs. Brandon, though, who is a new teacher to St. Regis, had expressed concerns about copyright violations and didn't accept a copy. Mrs. Lynn responded inappropriately and professionally to Ms. Brandon when she spoke to her about the issue, and so Mrs. Brandon went ahead and escalated her complaint to Mr. Sample, the principal. Then he spoke to Ms. Brandon, who defended her actions and then even went as far as to threaten to bring in PTA support. That would be a really big deal to Mr. Sample, because as an outsider coming into this community, it took him a really long time and a lot of hard work to gain the trust of the community. So what didn't happen, it didn't seem that teachers were properly aware or concerned about copyright rules or consequences, and then he did not, the principal did not speak to teachers who approached Mrs. Lynn with the idea of copying and distributing the software. These events took place at St. Regis High School, and around 4 months after the computer lab schedule had been put in place. So who is or might be involved in or concerned by the situation? We have some students, teachers, Mr. Sample, the principal, local residents and businesses, especially that they might have a stake in ensuring that the school is compliant with copyright laws or any laws of that any nature. The PTA, Parent Teacher Association group, who helps with funding, Mrs. Lynn, who is that computer library assistant in a full-time position, who had the part of copying and distributing the software and who had been unprofessional and threatening. Then we have Miss Williams, who received a copy of the materials and was grateful for it. And then, of course, Miss Brandon, who had expressed her concern and then escalated that to Mr. Sample. So on to section 2, Mrs. Brandon has been put in an ethical dilemma by the actions of Ms. Lynn. Mrs. Brandon was subjected to unfair and unprofessional comments made to Ms. Lynn, and the ethical standards of the school could be questioned by staff, community, anyone that really comes in and finds out about this. So the actions of Mrs. Lynn do constitute a breach of copyright law. It is illegal to make multiple copies of computer programs without the permission of the copyright holder. It's also a breach of contract because the agreement made by the parent faculty committee of the PTA was to purchase new software for the next 2 years, and this, depending on what your knowledge is of copyright law, goes against that agreement because they are creating more of something that had been purchased. That agreement did not include copying software programs for individual use in the classrooms. And then Mrs. Lynn's response to Miss Brandon's concerns also constitute harassment because she had made a derogatory comment about Miss Brandon's degree and was not respectful of her concerns. So, in one sentence, St. Regis School's library assistant, Mrs. Lynn, created copies of newly purchased software to install on all classroom computers for independent student usage, creating an ethical dilemma for Mrs. Brandon, a teacher at St. Regis School, who raised copyright concerns or issues with Mr. Sample, the principal. So on to section 4, it's super important to identify what has not been identified in order to ensure that all potential issues, challenges, and opportunities are identified and addressed, and a failure to do so could result in poor decision making, inadequate planning, and unforeseen consequences that could have otherwise been prevented. The value of missing information is that it highlights areas that require further investigation and research. Missing information can help identify knowledge gaps and can be then used to inform the development of research questions or areas of inquiry. And then by identifying what's missing, decision makers can work to fill in those gaps, which can lead to better decision making and more effective planning. So on to our knowns and unknowns. We already have been introduced to all of our known people. So on to our unknowns. It's unclear who Mr. Sample had to work so hard to form relationships with. It just talks about some community members or just the community in general, their culture, not being super open to outsiders. And there's also no information on the exact number of faculty or staff in the school. We have a roundabout number, but we don't know about any support staff or anything like that. So in regard to places, we're really just staying inside the town of St. Regis, and then in St. Regis School, we learn a little bit about the town itself, the drugstore, other small businesses, but just the mention of them. We hear about a high school that kids go to after St. Regis that they're bused to, but we are mainly just in the school and the classrooms of St. Regis School. So, like I said, we do not really have any extra information about any of the stores or anything in town, and we don't know after St. Regis School where the students are bused to or anything else about that high school they end up going to. In terms of programs, we hear about several. There's the state allocation program, which provides financial support to the school. Meager, it says. There's a couple of fundraising programs that happen during the year. And then there's the computer program that is launching and planned for the computer lab and then the purchase of software. The waiver program, which is how they got the part-time assistant into the full-time position since the former librarian retired and there was no applicants. Then we've got just your grade level programs, program of study, PTA as a program organization, and then of course the library and computer lab programs since they have so much focus. We do not have any kind of information about the specific software programs that were copied by Ms. Lynn or even purchased that year and then later distributed onto the third grade team. So moving on into section 5, reflective evaluation and prioritization of information. So could this conflict be damaging to stakeholders of the community? Since copyright infringement is illegal, it could result in legal action against the school, which then could be costly and damaging to the community and its reputation. The school could lose access to future software upgrades or support from the software provider, which could then negatively impact the education of the students. The conflict between Ms. Lynn and Ms. Brandon could create tension and division among faculty and staff, which then could unfortunately overflow and into the school's effectiveness and morale and just the quality of the experience students receive there. Students, teachers, the principal, the PTA, Ms. Lynn, Ms. Brandon, and then of course any of the authors or developers of the software are all individuals or groups who have an important stake in the outcome. And I would say that no, not all relevant stakeholders have been consulted. I went ahead and just logged, several of the things that had happened up until now, but there was no one that was consulted really regarding whether they could copy the software or not. The teachers did approach Ms. Lynn, and she thought, of course, it was a great idea due to her lack of training, but really no one was consulted, and of course we don't know what's next in the story. That's for us to figure out. So what else could I have known or learned about this situation in order to have made an even better decision? More about the budget, how much money is available for various expenses, and that would help me make informed decisions about technology purchases, staffing, things like that. Having a really good understanding of copyright laws, especially when it comes to software and digital media, it would be helpful to have, that information from the actual programs that had been purchased so that we would have the specifics, as well as what could happen if they were infringed upon, which they were, of course, in this case. The teacher opinions, we know that some of the teachers thought this was a great idea, but were there other teachers that were more in Miss Brandon's camp who were really concerned about what was happening? We don't even know if all of them knew about it. We don't know what the student needs are at St. Regis. Is it such a dire situation that this could be more justified? It would always be illegal, but there is a little bit of a difference. And then in terms of community support, we don't really know. We know that Mr. Sample has the community on his side at this time, but what about things like this? Are they kind of like what I just said? Well, the kids really need it, so it's not that bad. Or, are they maybe able to get more of what they need on a regular basis, and maybe just simply don't have the respect for the law that they should? Lastly, alternative solutions. Have we thought about the issue before of software distribution or the violations? Have we talked to the vendors? Have we seen if they would work with us on any kind of pricing break for maybe the 420 students, as opposed to just a few classrooms? Have we explored any open source materials? And by having all of that information, it would help us make a much more informed decision on how to proceed and develop a plan that would be in the best interest of students, teachers, the community, everyone going forward. So do we have enough information to make a decision? We can pull it together. So we could really use to make a super strong decision the school's policies and guidelines for copyrighted materials, the actual copyright details that came with the software, the potential legal consequences of violating the copyright laws, and whether any kind of training had ever been given. And then feedback and input from other stakeholders, including teachers, parents, or district officials.